Brawling over airplane seats, what you ought to know about heritage travel with Birthright's Jason Harris, and the Welsh take homesickness to the next level. I'm Joe Bauer, and welcome to another episode of Travel Tomorrow, the podcast about how travel trends influence our everyday lives, whether we travel or not. At first I read that as whether we like it or not. I guess that's kind of true too. And I'm joined as always by my co-host, Alicia Underly Nelson from Fargo. What's up, Alicia?
Nothing much. How are you?
Oh, I'm swell, and I see here in our little shared script document, and I assume it's okay. People know it's a podcast, and we have a little bit of a scripty outline thing. And I see back here, you've got highlighted banter topic. Pick one. Something weird. Maybe. I'm tired of talking about the weather.
I am. You talk about the weather every time.
We're from the Midwest. It's kind of in our DNA to inherently talk about the weather.
That's funny. I just wrote an essay about that, which you read. That yes, the weather is a stand-in talk for deeper things that we don't touch on. So give me something else. What's something else that you want to know? What's something that we can tell listeners about?
Well, you said something weird, and so of course my mind jumped all over the place, and nothing. Everything that came up was too weird to ask, and I don't think it'd be super interesting. And I tried to reel myself in and get us to stay on topic of this episode, heritage travel. So here's what I got, and we'll see if we can run with it. Here's my perhaps weird banter topic highlighted in our Google Doc. So we're talking about heritage travel. You and I have talked about this before. I've done a lot of heritage travel from my Jewish background. You have been studying Norwegian for your Norwegian background. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of cultures out there in the world. And as I'm sure you can appreciate, as I've appreciated, it's been nice to deep dive into one aspect of our background. It's been enriching and nice and lovely and all those, adjectives. But if you could have had another aspect to your cultural background, your ancestry, your heritage, is there a culture out there that you're like, it really would have been interesting to have grown up in that culture. I really would have liked to have an inherent reason to go into a deep dive into that culture and have that be part of my being. Is there any culture like that for you?
Ooh, I would say, that's a great question. I would think probably
Nailed it.
Mexico, because Mexico, I had a lot of classmates that had Mexican heritage, many of them maybe first or second or third generation immigrants, which is still fairly close. And so their connection to their culture was close, like mine was to my Scandinavian heritage. And like, I love Mexican food. I grew up listening to Selena, and I love Mexican music, and I've been to Mexico a couple times. I really enjoy it, and there's so much of the country that I haven't seen. So I'm very aware that while I've been there, I've really only scratched the surface. And I used to work with a couple guys from Mexico City who have always told me, like, you could explore Mexico City for the rest of your life and never even come close to seeing everything you need to see there. So I think, yeah, I'd be Mexican for sure. How about you?
How about me? Well, as you know, from exchanging different writing projects with one another, mm-hmm. I tend to hop around a bit. I can get really interested in one thing and just go deep dive into that, and then maybe it loses my interest for some reason. Not necessarily culture. It could be, I'm playing guitar every day, and then I go 2 months without playing guitar, something like that. So lately, and it's been kind of recurring, and I will admit to the impetus. The impetus was Moana.
Oh.
And if you've ever seen the film, and quick side note that I just think is funny, it's actually called Vaiana in Europe because a quasi-famous Italian porn star is named Moana, and they didn't want, the conflict of names or whatever on the continent, so the actors had to come in and re-record them saying Vaiana with different inflections to match it from the original film. And I always thought that was funny because this porn star probably wasn't that famous until that showed up.
And now
on
she's
IMDb
notorious.
Trivia.
Big boost.
Exactly. So, hats off or pants off, I guess, to Vaiana. Anyhoozle. I watched that film, and they use a lot of Polynesian mythology, history, legend, culture in that film. And I know that it kind of I saw one criticism of it saying that it kind of blends them all together when they are very separate things, like Hawaiian culture, Fijian culture, so on and so forth. But in general, I always thought this seafaring culture was really interesting, how they read the stars and how that's been very much embedded into their culture. And they show some of that in the film where they're building the ships and they're sailing around. Of course, I imagine myself singing "Away, Away" like they do in the movie. But and the scenery is so beautiful, and it ties back into, and I think we've talked about this before. And everybody always asks each other, if you could travel anywhere in the world, where would it be? Mm. And my answer has always been Fiji. But that impetus was back because at the Truman Show when I was just a kid from the suburbs and hadn't traveled anywhere, and he had the line, I want to go to Fiji because you can't go any further before you start going back. So I always had that kind of the back of my mind. Even before I had traveled anywhere, I had like a Lonely Planet Fiji guidebook. And then I saw that movie, and I just really thought that the culture seemed very interesting. It would be really cool to have that be part of you, to, have those legends of and the history of the sea travelers and all that history. I thought that'd be really cool.
That would be cool. I'm a descendant of seafaring people too, but on the opposite side of the world.
It sounds like yours were more murdery, though. If I understand history, Viking culture and raping and
I have lots of Viking and Celtic roots, so yeah, probably that's.
I don't know if the Celtics usually. I mean, I just think of like Ireland and being oppressed by the Brits, but the Viking side.
Vikings
I think
for
they
sure.
did some raping. Yeah, they did some raping and some pillaging.
Yeah, I think that would just be a realistic assessment because I'm like hugely Scandinavian, like 75%.
And I have to be honest, I see that in you.
Yeah,
that aspect of that culture.
That's pretty common. Yep, I'm pretty much a murderous.
You're
maniac.
A ruthless warrior.
I seem very sweet and kind, listeners, but don't cross me.
But then when you come visit, you suddenly are ransacking people's apartments and claiming them as your own.
Yeah, like when I tried to claim your apartment in Dusseldorf. It's terrible.
Exactly. To be fair, it was very cold where you were, and there was no food, so you had to take what you wanted from weaker people. I don't know why I just threw myself under the bus and said I was the weaker one who you just conquered.
Well, clearly.
I think we should move on.
Thank God you have a strong wife to defend your territory.
Yeah, she scared you off and, smacked some pans and stuff together or whatever.
Clearly.
Use bear spray. Whatever you have to do to get Scandinavians
to
run
away.
Like,
it's just escalating and going strange directions.
I thought I read it in a guide on how to scare off Scandinavian descendants. And
no,
I
that's
that was
a bear.
In there. Okay. Well, there's bears up there.
Yeah, both northern creatures.
I'm sure way back when a bear mixed into the gene pool when things were, really less taboo and it was cold and needed to warm up. I think a bear got into the gene pool somehow. It must be. It's probably on your 23andMe.
Wow. I wanted weird and I definitely got it. Can we go to the next stop?
Oh, certainly.
Now boarding.
Earlier this month, the internet went nuts when video surfaced of a man on an American Eagle flight, which is a subsidiary of American Airlines, from New Orleans to Charlotte, and was punching the seat of the woman in front of him. This happened back in January. Everybody was all up in arms earlier this month because he was seated at the back row of the plane, and his outburst was kind of a reaction to the fact that the woman in front of him had reclined her seat. Well, he couldn't because he was in that cheap row of seats where you just have the wall behind you. And obviously, if you have legs that are longer than mine, that limits your room to move around and, your ability to use your own tray table. Now, the woman who filmed the encounter, her name is Wendy Williams, and she told CNN that she moved her seat up when the man behind her asked if she would so that he could eat. But when she moved it back, he began punching her. She says the flight attendants did not help, so she filmed the interaction and shared it on Twitter. She's also said that she's had neck surgery in the past and that the man didn't just hit her seat, he hit her, which caused her bodily injury. Now, this really has escalated. There's a ton of reports. Fox Business says that Williams is considering pressing charges against the guy behind her. She told TMZ that the flight attendant that she flagged down for help gave her a passenger disturbance notice, which is a big deal. That's like a step before they begin talking about removing you from a flight, told her to delete the video, threatened federal charges, which does kind of make it sound like maybe there's more to this story in this confrontation than showed up in the video. The airline has said they're looking into it. Now, look, we all have had issues with airplane seats. Personal space is really not something that we're guaranteed on a plane. But okay, we're going to ignore the ethics of posting a video without obscuring a person's face, because I don't think that's cool. But the bigger question is, who is the bigger jerk here? The lady that's filming and flagging down help, or the guy that's punching her seat? Discuss.
Ooh, a discussion question. I'm not going to be any helpful here, because my mind always goes to the weird question. As soon as you said that CNN was talking to Wendy Williams, I just imagine, like, whose job was it when this happened? They saw the video on YouTube going viral or whatever. They were like, quick, get me Wendy Williams on the line. And who had to go run around and figure out how to contact Wendy Williams? That's where the only place my mind went to. Whether or not whose fault it was, I don't know.
But who's the bigger jerk? I mean, clearly it takes two people for things to escalate in this way. So is it the guy punching the seat? Is it the woman that's refusing to put her seat up? Is it the flight attendant that isn't helping? My aunt's a flight attendant, full disclosure, so my tendency is to assume that flight attendants want to keep things neutral as much as possible, because if anything like this happens, they have to deal with it. So I don't really see a flight attendant escalating this if they didn't have to.
I appreciate the disclaimer that you have family who is a flight attendant, as if somebody's going to do research, be like, oh, but Alicia, she has conflict of interest. Her aunt is a flight attendant, so her opinion on Travel Tomorrow is moot.
It could be a bias. I'm just saying, we got to examine these things.
Fair enough. I don't really have a strong opinion here. I think I saw the video, and I mean, I don't think anybody comes off super glowing. The man certainly looks like a tool punching the seat. It kind of seemed like it was a short film commenting on our times, perhaps.
Well, here's the comments that really got me thinking. So I thought, okay, these people are both not being very helpful. But what shocked me is then when everybody was commenting, there were so many people that were like, no, you never recline a seat. And I'm like, what? Never? Like, sure you do. Am I a jerk that like reclines her seat occasionally? Like, how is this possible?
Sounds like you might be.
How is this possible? You cannot
I never recline my seat.
You never recline your seat.
Yeah, you know why? Because I'd be a jerk.
Seriously. I mean, I understand, like, you leave it up when people are eating because that gets awkward. And if somebody has a laptop behind me, I'm sensitive to that. But I'm sorry, if I need to sleep, the seat comes down. That's the point of the seat. It's not my fault that airlines are making the space between seats smaller any more than it's the person behind me. Like, we all work it out. It's cool. Like, we do our best. But, like, to say you can never recline a seat, that's crazy to me.
I've always took it as an unspoken rule, because I understand what you're saying, that the airlines have made everything smaller, but should we really treat each other with less dignity because of the situation the airline has put us in? It sounds like you are saying that we should treat each other less favorably because of the situation. I, on the other hand, am more egalitarian. I believe that we should treat everybody the same, allow everybody to have the same seat. And actually, I think it's a test, Alicia. I think it's a test that society has put on us, that we have, sure, you have the freedom to pull your seat back for your own comfort at the expense of somebody else. It sounds like you take that bait. I, on the other hand, practice restraint.
How terribly virtuous of you. Well, speaking
of being...
well,
thank you. Thank you for saying that.
But it's not an egalitarian experiment, because if you can afford to spend more, then you get more room, you know? So really, it's like, let's pit poor people against each other and see who prioritizes their own sleep and health and wellness over the good of others. I mean, that's kind of a terrible choice to place on people too, isn't it?
That's true. It seems like it's like some kind of, it's the beginning of like a dystopian experiment. Like,
it is.
Who's just going to pay themselves who's going to spend the money to buy themselves out of the situation? And then meanwhile, we'll watch the commoners fight amongst themselves.
Precisely. That's what it seems like to me too. It bothers me. All right. So now the question, listeners, do you recline or not? We have a poll on TraveltomPod on Twitter and TravelTomorrowPod on Facebook. We want to know what you think. We want to know whose side you're on. Are you a jerk like Alicia, or are you a living saint? Like, well, Alicia's words, not mine, like myself. Please. Discuss amongst yourselves. Joe has our next stop.
Now boarding.
Today, our guest is Jason Harris. Jason is the host and producer of Jew Oughta Know, a podcast about the Jewish people from Genesis to modern Israel. and he was a Birthright Experience Program Manager for over 5 years. But before we dove into talking about heritage travel, I asked Jason to spell out exactly what Birthright is.
Birthright Israel is a free trip to Israel for Jews ages 18 to 32 now. Trips are usually 10 days long, sometimes 7. I'd say a typical trip will have you traveling all over the country, from the desert to the mountains to the beach to the cities to everywhere, usually with about 40 other people. The trips will also have Israelis your age or the age of the participants who will join for part or all of the trip, like local Israelis. The trips are run by experienced educators and guides. It's an all-around great adventure. It's lots of fun, lots of learning. I highly recommend.
And so why do you think a trip like this is necessary for Jewish communities, particularly communities in the Jewish diaspora?
Yeah. So Birthright Israel provided one answer to a challenge that really became apparent in the 1990s and even earlier, which is how to get young Jews to feel attached to their Jewish identity. Birthright Israel was started by 2 philanthropists who said, we're going to send every young Jew to Israel for free, because in sending them to Israel, they'll have a chance to meet other Jews, to visit important sites of Jewish heritage and the Jewish homeland, and they'll come away with a stronger Jewish identity that will last them the rest of their lives. So it was one answer to this question of how to sustain Jewish life and interest in each new generation.
And so how do you think, because that's what they set out to do, how do you think actually seeing and experiencing one's roots like that in a physical location, how do you think that makes a person see their identity differently?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of my Birthright trip participants from a few years ago, she told me that although she came on the trip wanting to find Judaism for herself, she realized that she was actually already a Jew. And I thought that was a beautiful sentiment, and it comes from a place of, I think, having the opportunity to really connect with this side of your identity in a deep way and in multiple ways. Birthright trips are jam-packed with activities from the moment you get up to when you go to sleep. It's totally exhausting, but being in the actual locations where Jewish history and culture and food and spirituality, where that all takes place, I think it gets people into a zone where they're constantly thinking about, what does this mean for me? And what feels relevant to me and what doesn't feel relevant to me? And that's really impactful. And it's a lot harder to do that when you're going about your daily life back home in San Francisco or Berlin or wherever. You really have to be, I think there's no substitute for being in the place.
And do you think it's different because in Birthright you're doing it with a group of people as opposed to some of the trips I've done myself where I've just gone on my own to heritage destinations? How is it different to be with a group of people doing the same thing?
Yeah. The number one thing I hear from Birthright participants is this is the most number of Jews I've ever been in a room with. Which is really funny. And because a lot of them didn't grow up like going to Hebrew school or Sunday school or in a big Jewish community where they had a lot of Jewish friends. And this is, for many of them, the first time they're experiencing like having Jewish friends, and everyone on the bus is Jewish, and you're all there together experiencing this trip and the things that happen on it, and it's just an incredible bonding experience, and then you then have that memory with those people forever.
I'm not sure how many of our listeners will know the sites in Israel that you go to, but I'm just curious if you could rattle off some of the places that you're heading to.
Oh boy. Jerusalem, the capital city, which has the old city of Jerusalem, which goes back thousands of years, and it's and in the old city you have the Western Wall, which is the holiest site in Judaism. It's a very spiritual city, a religious city, just fascinating history. But then down the road, you go to Tel Aviv, which is just major metropolitan city on the beach, and you'll go surfing, and you can go to the beach, and there's the markets and the nightlife, and so you get kind of those two different experiences. You head out into the desert, the Negev desert, and There's lots to do out there, and some fascinating historical sites to visit. But also, it's the desert. I mean, it's incredible out there. And then all the way up in the north of Israel, you have what's called the Galilee, which is, depending on the time of year, lush and green, and it's lots of hiking and forests and waterfalls and kibbutz, little formerly socialist villages that you can visit, and so you're really just you're going all over the place and seeing not only tourist sites but also some stuff off the beaten path.
What strikes me as particularly interesting, and it makes me really wish I could have gone myself, is that you have the mixture of the deeply religious side with Jerusalem, but then modern Tel Aviv, and then, as you just said, like the heart of Jewish socialism with the kibbutz. You're really getting the whole spectrum there, it seems like.
Yeah. And that's another thing that helps with the Jewish identity formation, which is most American Jews, to the extent that they grew up with Judaism at all, they grew up with it usually kind of in one way, which is whatever way it was with their parents. And to go to Israel and to realize there's a bazillion different ways one can practice Judaism and one can be Jewish, that I think has a real impact, because people suddenly realize, like, oh wait, there's a way to express my Judaism that works for me and that isn't just what my parents raised me with, but there's other ways of doing it, and this is mind-blowing to suddenly realize this. I'm just
thinking of a question off the top of my head. It seems that it's unique, and perhaps it's because with Jewishness and Judaism, there's so many things tied to these words. I mean, you can write take forever to write a novel about how do you even define a Jew, and the various ways that you could do that. Because it's interesting to me that in other cultures, like I'm thinking of Irish, that people will sometimes say, they identify as an Irish person or Irish heritage, and they might not even be Catholic at all, but then you have other people who say, like, well, I'm Irish Catholic, and that means a whole other thing. Or they might even still say, even though they could be an atheist, they still might say, I'm Irish Catholic. But it seems interesting to me that for Jews, that we have a hard time delineating between the different ways that you can be a Jew until you're shown it. Why do you think that is?
Well, you've touched on a real long history. The short version is, for thousands of years, Jews referred to themselves as Am Yisrael, which means the nation of Israel, in which the word nation means not a political state, but a people. And that's how we understood ourselves up until the Napoleonic era, when for various reasons that definition didn't seem to fit anymore, and we went through, for the next few hundred years, these contortions of, well, okay, we're a religion then, we're just a religion, and that didn't seem to be sufficient, and so then we said, well, we're an ethnicity, we're a race, Judaism is a race, and that didn't seem to fit. And in the last several decades, we've kind of come back around to this, well, maybe we had it right from the beginning, this notion of Am Yisrael, a Jewish peoplehood, which is the buzzwords in the Jewish community now, where the concept is that you belong to a people that is the Jewish people, in which Judaism isn't just a religion, it's the culture of the Jewish people. And so if you accept that, then there's lots of different ways that you can be Jewish, besides just one particular adherence, whether it's to religious authority or secular law or whatever it is. There's lots of different ways to be Jewish.
Have you spoken with anybody who's gone on a Birthright trip that maybe felt inspired to continue investigating their heritage through travel? Have they gone to Israel and then maybe found out their ancestors came from Hungary or Galicia or in Poland or something?
Oh, all the time. And one of the features about Birthright is that you can extend the trip. And so the trip is 10 days. But Birthright has an arrangement where you can extend your trip sometimes several months and still get that free ticket home. And so people all the time, I mean, I've done this myself. They go to Israel, they go for the 10-day trip, and then either they stay in Israel longer or they jet off to Europe to go travel or backpack or do whatever. Several people that I've taken on Birthright trips then went back to Israel. I've got a few people living there right now because they wanted to go back. And I think you also raised an important point about the heritage travel, which is Israel's not the only place. I mean, Jewish history is world history. And especially when it comes to Europe, I mean, anywhere you go in Europe, there's Jewish history there going back 1,000, 1,500 years. And if you're someone, like me, where my family's from Poland, I mean, I've been to Poland, I've been back to the village where my grandfather was raised and, inside his original apartment building, and the same with my grandmother. And so you don't have to go to Israel, you can go to places in Europe and trace those steps there as well. So, and of course, the Middle East is harder. I mean, a lot, more than half the Jews in Israel come from the Middle East, and because of modern politics, that's going to be a lot harder. You can't really travel freely around Iraq looking for your ancestral home, but in Europe, of course, you can.
Oh, that's interesting what you said about going to Poland. And we were talking earlier about the importance of being at the physical location. What was that like for you to be in the physical location of your ancestors in Poland?
Oh, it was incredible. Well, I was not only in the physical location, but I was with the physical ancestor. I brought my grandfather on the trip, it was me and my dad and my two uncles and my grandfather, and so we went back with him. He was a Holocaust survivor, so we went to the concentration camps, some of which he was at personally, and visited these places where he had grown up and remembered as a kid. And I mean, that's a once in a lifetime experience. I'll never forget it. I mean, that had just an enormous impact on my own sense of identity and family ties.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I'm personally glad that you got to have that experience.
Yeah, that was great.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit now. For better or worse, you can't talk about Israel or Birthright without it inherently being controversial to some extent. And an element that's come out of Birthright is this group, if not now. And although they don't define themselves as necessarily the antithesis to Birthright, a lot of the headlines they've appeared in are because of their stance on Birthright. And on their website, they claim that Birthright is, quote, hiding the truth about Israel, end quote, and that the trip, another quote, deliberately obscures the occupation and the truth about Israel. And they say that's happening by skipping over the checkpoints and Palestinians who live there and the discrimination experienced by Bedouin and Mizrahi Jews. And so I know this is obviously a sensitive, controversial topic, and that we're certainly not going to get an answer that pleases everyone. But as a travel experience for American Jews, because my understanding is that this group is made up by American Jews, how much of that critique do you feel is valid?
Yeah, great question. You'll tell me if this makes sense. I think their foreground critique is valid in that Birthright is not a trip focused on the occupation. And if you are coming expecting that or wanting that or wanting to be an activist around that, then you will be disappointed. But what I reject is, if not now's premise that Birthright is hiding the truth, like it's some kind of conspiracy and like there's some kind of central truth. The whole world knows that Israel occupies the Palestinians in the West Bank. I'm not sure how you hide that. Everybody knows that it's there. If not now as a group with a right or wrong, if not now as a group with a very clear partisan political agenda. I mean, they are pushing something, whether you agree with it or not. Birthright is not. I mean, Birthright has never had an agenda around getting Jews to support or reject any particular Israeli government policy. So there's a mismatch there between an educational heritage travel program and a divisive political group. So I really think it depends on what you want and expect from a trip to Israel. If you want a 10-day trip that only addresses the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then yeah, you will be disappointed. Birthright, in my experience, tries to show a little bit of everything, including the conflict, but there isn't enough time in 10 days to do a deep dive on any one thing. And I also think it's important to note that Birthright has never advertised itself as being a trip about the conflict. I mean, the conflict is only one part of the bigger Israel story, which is itself part of the much bigger Jewish historical story, and Birthright is telling the Jewish story. I mean, this is a trip about Jewish heritage, and it's primarily focused on people who don't know very much about their own history and heritage. I will say, I do think a lot depends on the guides and the educators that you have staffing these trips. I mean, I've had guides who were themselves Mizrahi Jews, and they talk openly about the struggles faced by that community. And they can do so in a way that a guide who isn't a Mizrahi Jew might have a harder time with. I've had guides talk about the Bedouin and the Israeli Arabs. I've had guides take the group to the wall in Jerusalem that separates the parts of the city, the security fence or barrier, whatever you want to call it. Every time my bus has driven through a checkpoint, I've pointed it out to my participants. And I've never told a participant that I'm not going to talk about something. I always encourage people to ask whatever they want to ask, no matter how politically incorrect they might worry that it is. But look, it's a huge operation, and not every staff person on the trip is going to be willing or able to talk about that stuff in depth. So I say you should ask any question you want to ask on this trip, and not hesitate. And you should also be asking with an open mind and prepared to hear opinions that maybe you're not going to like. And that's okay, because I think the point here is to learn something.
If somebody did go on a Birthright trip, or if they said, I'm not going to go on a Birthright trip because they think that they're not going to get the trip that they want, what would you suggest they do in order to, if they're interested in, because it seems like this organization is interested in traveling or diving into the conflict, do you have any recommendations? Whether it's for Jews, I mean, obviously it's the Middle East. People are interested. There's people who are interested from all perspectives, not just American Jews. If somebody were interested in traveling for that purpose, does Birthright give any suggestions on how to do that, or do you just yourself have any suggestions on how to have that travel experience if you don't think if you're not sure that Birthright is going to be able to provide it?
Well, yeah, I mean, Birthright is not the only way to travel to Israel. I mean, there's a gazillion Jewish organizations out there, and they all, not all, but most of them have some sort of mission trip to Israel. And of course, there's just traveling on your own. I mean, there's nothing stopping anybody from buying a plane ticket and flying to Israel. It won't be free as it is with Birthright. But again, I think it's really what you're looking for. I mean, there are, I don't know whether If Not Now, I don't think If Not Now has their own trips to Israel, but I also sort of haven't been paying attention to them in the past year or so that much. So I don't know if they do. Look, I'm an educator, and so I'm interested in learning something and education and experience. I'm personally am not interested in being a political activist and going on an activist trip like that. So for me, I wouldn't be that attracted to that kind of a trip, and I certainly have my own issues with If Not Now. But yeah, I mean, there's nothing stopping If Not Now from raising however much money it would take for them to put on a trip to Israel. And so if that's something that somebody wants to do, because they don't want to do Birthright, then, okay. I'm not, don't go, go somewhere else. So I think that's okay.
And kind of wrapping it up to bring it back to more broad discussion. We've talked on this podcast before about heritage travel, and I'm sure we're going to do it again, but I'm wondering why you find these kinds of travel experiences more worthwhile or rewarding. Why would you encourage listeners to follow their own ancestral trail, whether they're Jewish or not?
Well, I'm someone who loves history. So for me, there's no substitute for standing like in the exact place where something happened, or like holding an object from the past, especially my own Jewish past. That for me is just like pure nerd out geekness, amazingness. So look, to whatever extent we're aware of it or not, our past, even our deep past, informs who we are. And I think that the more we understand that, the richer our lives will be. And I say it's a lifelong journey and you can't reach the end of it. So you may as well keep going and dive in. Just as an example, when I'm in Jerusalem, I go to the Western Wall. The Western Wall is considered the holiest place in Judaism today. And I go there and I touch the wall and I'm surrounded by people who are praying their hearts out. And sometimes they are incredibly emotional and really feeling this divine presence. And I'm not someone who is particularly devout or spends a lot of time thinking about God. I'm not a huge believer. But when I'm at the Western Wall, I am thinking that there are millions of Jews who before me either came here to touch the same stones or prayed every day their entire lives that they would someday get to. And now here I am. And so I feel that connection. I feel that connection, not so much with God, but with the Jewish people, with who I consider to be my people. And so I think that's where the ancestral trail will take you. And even if I don't feel it every single time, the times when I do feel it makes everything else worthwhile. And I think that's the gift of heritage and travel.
Yeah, I can obviously agree with that. When I was in northeastern Slovakia almost a year ago and following my ancestral path, I mean, even just the research and finally finding out where my ancestors came from, because it was Austro-Hungary back then, and all the documents they alternated between putting Austria or Hungary depending on the census, and there was never a town. But when I found that town and I got to that area and I walked around, it sounds depressing, but when I even walking around the cemeteries where,
I love the cemeteries.
My ancestors, I feel bad like saying that I enjoyed this experience, because it's also sad, because the one cemetery where surely I had ancestors buried, all of the tombstones had been destroyed. I was told by a guy that it was during the communist period and it was used, just as like building material, and there was only there's like a half of a tombstone left where you can see a little Hebrew on it. But even just being there, being around the streets that I know that they would have walked around, being in the town that I'm sure they visited and walked around the city, it's a difficult thing to describe, but it made it all the more worthwhile. And I don't know about you for your Polish experience more so than Israel, but for me, going to someplace like this was Bardejov, Slovakia, and the town that they were from is Dubin, Slovakia, and to know that so many, basically the only other people who I've talked to who have been to this town, and even Googling on the New York Times, it was Jews who did ancestral trips to this town from the United States, and then like a very distant cousin that I found who did the same thing in like the late 90s. So it seems like it made it, besides walking in my ancestors' footsteps, having it be this experience that because my ancestors lived there, I was having this unique travel experience that most people aren't going to have because they're not going to know what Bardejov, Slovakia is.
Right. But there's a flip side to that I find very comforting, which is to appreciate that whatever happens to me and wherever I end up and wherever I end up burying, there will probably be, continuing on for the next couple hundred years, Jews coming to visit. And how incredible. I mean, these little tiny towns in Europe that, as you say, no one's ever heard of or visited, and there's like 5 people that live there, but American Jews are still coming to walk in the footsteps of their ancestors. And so I feel like, wow, like that's going to happen to me. My descendants in 100, 200 years from now are going to do the same thing. And I find that very comforting on a kind of cosmic level.
Again, that was Jason Harris, host of Jew Oughta Know. Now, Alicia, I talked a lot about, and probably in other podcasts, I don't know, I don't remember, I think I did, but I certainly talked in this conversation with Jason about, touched on a little bit on my own heritage travels, but I know you, as we talked a little bit at the beginning of the show, have gotten into your heritage a bit, and you were actually in Sweden when you found out you had some Swedish heritage, and you are, of course, studying Norwegian. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your heritage travels and your heritage research and what that's meant for you?
Sure. I think a lot of my heritage travel sort of happened by accident. I'm primarily Norwegian, which is something that I've always known about. It's a huge part of my upbringing and my culture and the food that I ate. I'm studying Norwegian. I just got an email from my Norwegian teacher about classes starting up, like literally as we're recording. And so that's something that I've always been really familiar with. So it was a surprise when I took my DNA test and discovered that I had a very large portion of Swedish ancestry too, which probably doesn't sound like a surprise. Sweden and Norway are very close to each other. They were technically part of the same country for a long period of time. But for people that are Norwegian, this is something almost unheard of. And it was really interesting to be sitting on the floor of a Gothenburg, Sweden hotel room and find out that I'm Swedish. And I was scheduled to go out and look at a museum that covered Scandinavian art. And like, as I'm walking there, I'm thinking like, because I don't know anything about my Swedish background at all. I'm like, this, I could be from this actual place. I have no idea. And it was really weird to start at zero in the place where I happened to be standing at that moment. And I walked and I looked around at this building, and I remember what I would have thought, I'm going to research, I'm in Sweden, but I wanted to know more about the Norwegian art. And suddenly I was like, wow, look at this. Like, a lot of this really applies to me in a way that I've never even considered. And it was so interesting too to talk to Swedes that I was chatting with and find that they've had some surprises too. Like, they assumed, oh, my family has lived here forever. We only married other Swedes, and they found they were Icelandic, or they had some Danish heritage, or North Africa. I mean, like, all these different things that they weren't anticipating. So I think heritage travel is cool because the narratives that we're told, the traditions that we grew up with, and the stories that we hear, they're never the whole story. I mean, there's always something that we can dive into. So I think that's really interesting. And it sounds like you've had that experience too, and that so many people that go on these birthright trips are kind of trying to assemble all those parts into that question that we all ask, which is, who am I and how much does the past matter to who I am right now?
Right. And Jason and I talked a lot about how special it is to be in the physical place. Have you actually gotten to go anywhere that ancient Alicia's, for lack of a better family description, have been in Scandinavia? Have you found out, like, this is where great-great-grandmother, however you say that in Norwegian, this is where she comes from and I'm in the same place? Or has it only been, that they're from there and you've been in the same country, so, more or less?
I've been in the same country. I also have Scottish, English, and Irish heritage on one side. So I've been to England and I've been to Ireland. I haven't been to Scotland yet. And I've been to Sweden. So I've been in the country, but I've never really been in any city where I know that my ancestors have lived. And I have a lot of information on that. And for lots of people, I grew up in a predominantly Norwegian American part of Minnesota. So for a lot of people, we know, like, the street where people grew up. And my great grandpa came here when he was 7. So, like, he left an amazing list of, like, hills he used to climb and rivers he used to cross and things like that. So for me, that's always kind of been the gold standard, to actually retrace his steps and all my other family that come from Norway. But that's a big trip, and like, it can be its own burden when you have, like, most people don't have a lot of information to go on at all. And in some ways, with the majority of my family, like from the British Isles, I don't know anything at all. But with my family from Norway, I have the opposite problem, where I have binders full of information and almost no idea where to start.
Well, another thing I wanted to ask you before, and this is going to be a perfect little segue into our language love segment. You're studying Norwegian, and I've been dabbling into Yiddish, and it's been interesting because how similar Yiddish is, and I can actually understand quite a bit, but been learning the Hebrew alphabet and figuring out what the differences are, and I've been studying some Hebrew too. And you're studying Norwegian, and we're both doing these things because it's involved in our heritage thing, but somebody from the outside might be like, well, especially for Yiddish and as well for Norwegian, that they're not particularly useful languages in the modern era, in which most people from Norway can speak English. Most people who speak Yiddish can speak another common language that I can speak. So what's it been meant for you to learn Norwegian? Why are you learning Norwegian? How are you planning on using that?
I'm learning it in a group setting at the Sons of Norway, which is a communal lodge that is for both men and women. You can be of Scandinavian descent, you can be Scandinavian through marriage, you can be Scandinavian through interest. So lots of us get together. There ends up being about 50 of us studying in different groups. And what I love about it is that it's very much learning language in community. I speak Spanish as well, and I've really struggled to even find somebody that will have conversations with me, sit down and have a cup of coffee and speak only in Spanish. Whereas with this Norwegian learning, I really expected this to be sort of a dusty relic that some of the older members, because the stereotype is a Sons of Norway member is 80 years old and their grandparents, their great-grandparents spoke Norwegian in the home, but it's really very much a living language in where I'm from. My grandma is 90 and she spoke Norwegian before she went to school. She studied it. So I can sit and talk to people, and like we always joke that we're the little kids. I can say in Norwegian, like, hello, here is the food. Would you like the food? I'm like a little kid. But there's people that are just doing book clubs and analyzing New York Times articles. Just they're doing it in Norwegian. And it's really cool to have and everybody that's further along than we are. It's just immersion for that time that we're there. They're asking you for the coffee. They're going to do their best to ask you in Norwegian, and they'll help you out if you need some help. But that's the kind of deep dive that I've really been craving, and it's really interesting. It's made me interested in things that I wasn't very curious about before. I thought I knew a lot about what my heritage meant, and I didn't. And there's a lot of interesting new interpretations of Norwegian art, new ways the language is being used, new books. I thought I knew what I was talking about, and I didn't. So it's good to be surprised.
Oh, I like that we have you on the record saying that you thought you knew what you were talking about, but you don't.
That's common, though. That's the only way that you learn anything. I was telling my son this the other day, so that I thought I knew what the answer would be, and I was wrong. Like, great, yeah, that's life. That means that you're learning something. That means that you're pushing if things always turn out the way that we think that they will. I don't know. You're not trying hard enough. You're not pushing the boundaries enough.
That sounds like the last chapter to your book about retracing your ancestors' mountain climbing.
I would totally do that. I did a little mountain climbing in Spain, and that's good for me because I hike a lot, but I am a flatlander, so it is a different thing to get a little elevation in there.
That sounds like Middle Earth or something. I'm a flatlander.
Oh, for sure. It is people will say, like, it's just as
keep
hard.
the hilltoppers
no, it's
away
really
from
not.
me.
Yeah, I like that. It's my quirky elven identity.
Well, since you've got this apparent love for languages, why don't you tell us what today's language love is?
Blah 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 blah.
Today's word is hiraeth, and that is Welsh, and I probably pronounced it badly, but it's a beautiful word, and it's the first word that came to mind when I heard the interview today. And it's a deep and sometimes sad or nostalgic or romantic longing for home. But it's a home that might not be possible to return to, either because the era is gone, because the people that made up that place are no longer with us, or because the situation has changed that kind of golden age won't ever occur again. And I think of that, I mean, what an amazing word for heritage travel, because what we're looking for, I think, when we go to explore places that were resonant to our ancestors is we're looking for that feeling. Like we know that we can stand there and stand in the same cemetery where they buried their dead or sit on the family farm. But we're not really looking for that place necessarily. We're looking and trying to tap into that feeling and try to imagine what it was like when people that we've never met lived there. So like, oh, it's incredible to me. Like, it's such a nostalgic and powerful thing.
It's a nice word. We actually have one in German, Heimweh. It's basically the same thing. I'm not sure if it also encompasses an era that you can't possibly return to, an era that's gone. I'm not sure if that quite would qualify, but it is basically longing for home, and a romantic longing for home, I think would suffice. So yeah, it's interesting to see that these concepts run across cultures and languages.
Yeah, it's such a human experience that it pops up. It pops up in Portuguese too. So I think that just shows you, like, we all feel that ache. So it's, linguistics can teach you a lot about what we feel.
And on that warm feeling of ache, I guess, that's it for this episode of Travel Tomorrow. Thanks as always for tuning in. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please, for the love of God, do us a favor and rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts.
And we'd love to keep in touch with you. Follow us at traveltompod on Twitter, traveltomorrowpod on Facebook, and take the reclining seat poll. I want to know. You can also email us your thoughts and opinions, things that you'd like to know about more in the future, shows that you liked in the past. We're at traveltomorrowpod@gmail.com. We want to give a big thanks to the Fiddle Revolt for the wonderful theme music, and remind you that you can subscribe to Travel Tomorrow wherever you get your podcasts.
Wherever you get your podcasts, you say?
Indeed.